Today with our politics lead, it is official. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will meet with the president of Ukraine this week in Kiev, arriving after the top diplomat there, Bill Taylor, who testified in the impeachment inquiry, was encouraged to leave his post. And as we learn new details about the White House efforts to withhold hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid to Ukraine to, at least in part, push Ukraine to commence an investigation that might help President Trump politically, as admitted by the White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. In emails obtained by the New York Times, Mulvaney asked about withholding the aid nearly a month before that now infamous Trump-Ukraine phone call in July, only to be cautioned by one advisor, quote, expect Congress to become unhinged, unquote. The Times also reports a previously unknown meeting where President Trump's top national security officials tried to convince him to release the aid, arguing it was in the best interest of the United States, only to be rebuffed by a defiant President Trump. CNN's Caitlin Collins now takes a closer look at this failed pressure campaign and what this might mean for the impeachment trial in the Senate.
President Trump is starting his second week in Florida at his West Palm Beach golf course today. But although he's miles away from Washington, impeachment is still at the top of his mind and in the headlines. A report from the New York Times reveals new details about Trump's demand to withhold nearly $400 million in military aid to Ukraine, with a top aide to the chief of staff accurately predicting the chaos it would cause. Rob Blair telling Mick Mulvaney in an email over the summer, well before Trump was impeached, that restricting the aid was possible, but that the White House should, quote, expect Congress to become unhinged. The report also reveals that in late August, the Secretary of State, Defense Secretary, and National Security Advisor all met with Trump to convince him to release the aid. According to the Times, then National Security Advisor John Bolton told Trump it was in America's interest. And the Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, added, this defense relationship, we have gotten some really good benefits from it. But Trump's mind wasn't changed by their united front. Instead, he responded, Ukraine is a corrupt country. We are pissing away our money. In between rounds of golf and dinners with old friends, sources say Trump is assembling his defense team for his looming impeachment trial. He was seen golfing with former South Carolina Congressman Trey Gowdy on Sunday, who has been giving him impeachment advice from the outside. But the trial remains at an impasse, with Republicans and Democrats at odds over what it should look like.
When the American people walk away from the Senate trial, if we ever have one, I don't want them saying, well, we were just run over by the same truck twice.
Trump has also been on the phone with world leaders, including the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The White House says Putin called to thank Trump for sharing information that thwarted a potential terrorist attack in Russia. Now, Jake, yesterday the president was golfing with Trey Gowdy. Today it's Senator Lindsey Graham, who we should know in a recent interview with the Daily Beast said that Rudy Giuliani should vet that information he got while he was in Ukraine through the intelligence community before briefing any lawmakers on it, because he says it could be Russian propaganda.
Gee, I wonder. Caitlin Collins, thank you so much. And let's talk about this now. Let me start with you. Big picture, these revelations from the New York Times, everything going on behind the scenes about this pressure campaign on Ukraine, withholding the aid. Will this affect the trial? Will it affect the demands, the requests from Democrats to have witnesses?
I think it helps Democrats make their case that these are the people that would not show up for the House's impeachment inquiry. Clearly, they knew something about it. Clearly, there was discussions going on. We had some inkling of that from Gordon Sondland's testimony and others. We'd seen some emails passed around. But this is even more corroboration of what they've suspected the whole time, which is that everybody knew something about what was going on with the aid money, and thus making it that much more incumbent to hear from these witnesses. That doesn't necessarily change the minds, though, of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and others who just want to get this done with, say, let's stick to the facts that was in the House's inquiry and just not add anything more and not have any new witnesses at all. But this is going to be a reinvigorated fight now along the exact same parameters that we've been having it for the last few weeks.
It does give Speaker Pelosi an opportunity to continue to withhold the articles of impeachment. Prior to this, it was just a broader sense of fairness and wanting to have witnesses and more of an appropriate standard trial. But now there's actually something for Democrats to hang their hat on, which is that the witnesses that they subpoenaed that were blocked by the White House have material evidence and can speak directly to the crimes perpetrated by the President of the United States. So in theory, Speaker Pelosi now has an actual argument versus just a political argument to withhold articles of impeachment indefinitely, potentially even fighting these subpoenas to the Supreme Court.
I think there's not a whole lot new in this article other than what we already knew. This puts a little meat on the bones. What stood out with me was the fact we all knew that Mick Mulvaney is really carrying the president's water on this, but there are key meetings that he was left out of. What was the reason for that? Was it to give himself plausible deniability, or was it for the president and Rudy Giuliani to have attorney-client privilege? I think that is one of the questions that many Democrats will have moving forward. They might have some questions for Mitch Mulvaney, but the reality is Republicans in the Senate pretty much have their minds made up, and they know exactly what they're going to do moving forward, and I don't see anything out of this article that's going to change their minds.
Although, Jane, I have to say, I mean, Mick Mulvaney is in these emails that the New York Times uncovered a month before the call talking about withholding the aid.
I agree that I don't think this is going to change minds for Republicans, because I think Republicans are answering to a larger and more important master, which is Trump, who basically holds control of their popularity with voters. And I also think it's interesting, though, that we see so many times with this administration, there's been a kind of a standard deviation difference between Donald Trump and the Trump administration. And you see in these emails and time again, that deviation, that difference breaking down, that what Trump wants becomes what the administration wants. We saw earlier how the Trump administration has been very tough on Russia, while Trump himself has not been. But again, we're starting to see that line break over and over again.
It also, though, points to what happens when Democrats decide they're no longer going to be playing to what Republican senators may or may not do, right? This is part of taking the power of the party back, and it's something that you'll see out in the campaign trail as well. And now we're seeing what the official government version of that looks like, with Nancy Pelosi saying it really doesn't matter what Mitch McConnell thinks anymore and who he's playing to. I'm playing to the 50% of Americans who believe that the president not only should be impeached, but should be removed.
But the problem is there that it's not a hard and fast 50%. And that 50% of Americans is not voting just on impeachment. And Democrats this entire time have not wanted to become the party that just wants to impeach the president. They wanted to get that over with so they could go back to the kitchen table issues. The longer this goes on, with her not passing the articles, that becomes problematic for the Democrats after a while. And also, look, there's another element here that we're not talking about, which is the president and what the president potentially tweets. And if he gets upset, we were talking before this article about, he's firing off about the whistleblower, about Nancy Pelosi. Does he say, let's just make a deal on witnesses and say he doesn't care anymore and undercut the Senate Republicans' position? All of that matters, too. And the more time that goes on without a resolution of this, the more Trump becomes an element that could shift the balances. And remember, as much as it's not about playing to the GOP senators in the middle, they are going to be the ones that will cast the deciding votes about whether you have a deal to have certain witnesses or no witnesses at all.
Which is why Pelosi maintaining her power and making sure that Trump doesn't get the automatic acquittal in January or February that he's been hoping for.
The reality is, yes, 50% support impeachment, but 50% don't. And the House process has not really moved the needle whatsoever. And there have been some polls out that after this House inquiry and the investigation, the support for impeachment has gone down and the president's approval rating has gone up. That is something that Nancy Pelosi cannot fight against. And the reality is she has control in the House and how they executed their inquiry. Mitch McConnell has control in the Senate, and he's going to be the one to determine how and when they move forward.
And Jane, you were talking about the divergence between what Trump wanted and the administration and how they're actually coming together, the administration getting more in line with what the commander-in-chief actually wants. The Times also reports that the budget office lawyers were working with the White House and the Justice Department on a legal argument. Because remember, this aid was not just President Trump's back pocket cash to give to whomever he wanted. Congress passed it. The House passed it. The Senate passed it. The president signed it into law. He had to give it up, and they were working to Ukraine. And the White House legal office and budget office were working on ways to figure out how constitutionally he could withhold it, even though I'm not sure that he could.
Right. And you see in the piece how emails back to it were saying, no, this is ridiculous. I'm speechless that you would even suggest that. But I want to get back to something You mentioned how Americans are focused on kitchen table issues, but I also think Americans are focused on kitchen table issues like corruption. Corruption is how this story allegedly began, Trump's purported concern about corruption. But I think Americans can easily talk about issues like corruption in government while talking about health care or defense and other issues as well. But I also think it's important to remember that all of this is tied together in context. You mentioned Trump's polling number is going up. Trump's polling numbers may have gone up or remained static, possibly because of good economic indicators.
True.
Though, the stock market does not really tell you how most people are, because 55% of Americans hold stocks and the other do not. But I think it's important to remember that all of this polling, all of this information is taking place in a context, and that context impacts how people are polled, and that context impacts how people feel about the presidency or even the process of impeachment itself.
And then, Nayyera, I just want to ask you, what do you make about the fact we finally got a readout from the White House on the call between Putin and Trump that was placed on Sunday? It's not unusual now that the president will have a call with the president of Russia or wherever, and we in the press and the American people, we don't find out about it originally from the White House, as it used to be the case. We find out about it from state media in Russia, in Moscow.
Right. We were all horrified, I think it was 2 years ago, when the first meeting with the foreign minister of Russia, as well as a Russian state media reporter, were allowed in the Oval Office, and White House reporters weren't. And unfortunately, that has continued to be the norm of this presidency. And we see that the president is incapable of separating his responsibilities for national security as a president and his own personal interests. And that's ultimately what is underlying all of the conversation of corruption and impeachment and the campaigns.
And Ukraine, obviously. Everyone stick around. We got a lot more to talk about. Up next, multiple violent attacks on religious communities.